Palmer likens it to how we use words like here or there to indicate spatial distance. We have ways to refer to future time, but not a dedicated grammatical tense marker for it. And similarly, the traditional subjunctive mood, often taught as a separate set of verb forms, doesn't really exist morphologically in modern English.
Palmer argues that what's often called the subjunctive in English is actually just the past tense form used in specific contexts, like impossible wishes or unreal conditions. I wish I knew if John came.
What about if I were you? That looks different.
He points out that the form were in, if I were you, isn't proof of a unique subjunctive form. Rather, he suggests wars might be considered the irregular past tense form for singular subjects, as the regular past tense is the same across all persons and numbers, i.e. what they liked.
So wars is the weird one.
The form war is the historically older past form that survives in this specific context. Thinking of was as irregular rather than were as special flips the usual perspective.
That is fascinating. Let's move to person, the distinction between the speaker, the one spoken to you, and the one spoken about, he, she, it.
The singular is relatively clear, but the plural is more complex. We-o doesn't usually mean simply multiple speakers.
Usually not, unless it's a chorus, maybe.
It often includes the speaker plus someone else, you or they. You as a plural, y'all in some dialects, refers to multiple people being spoken to. Only they is restricted to people or things being spoken about.
Palmer notes historical shifts, too. Older English had a distinct second-person singular pronoun, thou, thee.
Now mostly archaic.
Now mostly archaic, except in religious contexts addressing God. When this distinction was lost, you became the pronoun for both singular and plural second person.
Which is why some dialects have innovated new forms like y'all or use to recreate the plural distinction. Language adapts.
And there are other intriguing usages. The royal or editorial we, referring to one person, the matronly we, how are we feeling today?
The indefinite you never know what's going to happen. And that singular they we discussed earlier for unspecified sex. If anyone calls, tell them I'm busy.
And other languages can be way more complex.
Other languages, especially in Southeast Asia, can have far more complex pronoun systems with distinctions English lacks.
Number seems more straightforward, singular versus plural.
For the most part, yes, marked regularly with s in English. But again, anomalies exist. Child, children, mouse, mice, showing vowel changes or older endings.
Irregulars.
And words like sheep, deer, fish, where the singular and plural forms are the same. Then there are words that are only used in the plural, like scissors, trousers, pliers.
Chloralia tantum, right.
Right. Palmer points out the interesting grammatical behavior here. You can't say one scissors or 10 scissors. You have to use phrases like a pair of scissors. You use plural demonstratives, these scissors, but can't use numerals directly, challenging the simple rule that numerals go with plural nouns.
What about mood, another term often linked to Latin?
In Latin and Greek, there were specific subjunctive or optative verb forms used in certain types of subordinate clauses, indirect commands, purpose, conditions, or to express possibility or wish.
So specific verb endings for mood.
The choice of mood was often grammatically triggered in specific constructions, sometimes without adding much semantic moodiness.
English doesn't have a system of distinct mood forms like this, but we have modals, verbs like will, shall, can, may, must, ought, dare, need.
Palmer defines these formally by their grammatical behavior. They don't take s in the third person singular, are followed by the bare infinitive, etc.
And meaning-wise.
Semantically, they share meanings related to possibility, necessity, permission, or obligation, which loosely connects them to the idea of mood. Palmer suggests that the traditional labeling of will, shall plus verb as the future tense might be linked to the semantic idea of the future as potential or hypothetical, aligning it somewhat with mood rather than just a time marker.
So again, don't just impose the Latin idea.
His core point is to avoid imposing Latin-based definitions of mood onto English or other languages where the categories are formally different.
Voice active and passive is fairly standard in English grammar teaching.
Yes, typically applied to transitive verbs, those that take a direct object. Palmer mentions a potential middle voice in English, actions done to oneself or for one's benefit, like he washes easily, meaning he's easily washed, or the door opened. But notes, there isn't a distinct set of verb forms specifically for this.
Other languages might have more voices.
Other languages can have more complex voice systems, sometimes involving verb agreement with both subject and object, as Palmer mentions for Malagasy.
And finally, case.
Palmer explains case not as a single category, but a set of noun or pronoun forms that signal different grammatical functions.
Like subject, object.
Using Latin's 7 cases for the word amicus, friend, as an illustration. Nominative for subject, amicus venit, the friend comes. Accusative for direct object, video amicum, I see the friend. Dative for indirect object, donal amicum, I give to the friend. Vocative for addressing, oi emi, o friend. Genitive for possession, liber amici, the book of the friend. And 2 uses for the ablative case, often after certain prepositions or for means instrument.
Okay, so Latin had lots of case endings.
Latin even used the accusative case after some prepositions. Add amicum to the friend.
So different forms signal grammatical role. English has very limited case on nouns, only the genitive s.
But more visible case on pronouns. Ime, he, him, she, or we, they, them.
Right.
And languages vary hugely here. Palmer mentions Finnish, often cited as having 15 cases, though he notes many of these are noun stems combined with suffixes that function much like postpositions.
Prepositions that come after the noun?
Exactly, like in Turkish. He also gives an example from Bylan, where a genitive noun form behaves morphologically like an adjective and must agree in case, number, and gender with the noun. It modifies a very different system than English possession.
And this idea of grammatical elements matching each other is called agreement or concord.
Yes. Verbs agree with their subject in number and person. I like versus he likes. In languages with gender or case, adjectives and articles often agree with the nouns they modify in gender, number, and case, as seen in Spanish or Russian examples.
Palmer gives examples.
Palmer highlights the Swahili example, where different noun classes, back class versus key class, trigger different prefixes on the verb. He also brings back the Arabic example of the verb to be, requiring the following noun to be in the accusative case, just like a transitive verb takes an accusative object.
Which is completely different from the Latin-based rule that led to it is I. In Arabic-based logic, it's me would be correct because me is the accusative form.
Precisely. It's another stark illustration of how arbitrary and language-specific these grammatical rules can be when viewed cross-linguistically. The categories themselves and how they function vary immensely.
So having looked at units like words and the categories they carry, how do linguists move to mapping the structure of sentences, which are combinations of these units? Palmer takes us through some key approaches, starting with immediate constituent analysis.
IC analysis was a technique developed by American structuralists in the mid-20th century. They felt they had developed rigorous methods for analyzing sounds, phonology, and word structure, morphology.
They had those down.
But syntax felt less systematic. IC analysis aimed to find the hierarchical structure of sentences by dividing them into their constituent parts.
The basic principle is to cut a sentence into its 2 main parts, then cut those parts into 2, and continue this binary division until you reach the smallest meaningful units, the morphemes.
Right. Palmer illustrates with a simple sentence like, the young man followed a girl.
How would that work?
You might initially cut it into the young man and followed a girl. Then the young man is cut into the and young man and followed a girl into followed and a girl. You keep cutting the phrases down until you get to the individual words or morphemes like follow and ed.
And this creates a tree diagram.
This process creates a tree diagram showing how smaller units group together into larger ones.
How do you decide where to make the cuts? Palmer mentions the idea of expansion.
Yes. The idea is that a sequence of words can often substitute for a single word or a smaller sequence. For example, the young man can be replaced by man. This points to man being the central element or head.
What are endocentric constructions?
Constructions where the whole phrase can substitute for one of its parts or which contain a recognizable head are called endocentric constructions, like noun phrases or verb phrases.
Exocentric.
Constructions where there's no single head and the whole phrase doesn't substitute for one of its parts, like prepositional phrases with a paper, are exocentric. IC analysis uses this substitutability to guide the cuts.
And Palmer notes that IC analysis can effectively illustrate structural ambiguity.
It can. Take the old men and women. An IC analysis can show 2 different possible structures. One where old modifies men and women.
Meaning both are old.
Or another structure where old man is one constituent and women is another coordinated higher up.
Meaning only the men are old.
Right. He gives other examples like Egyptian cotton shirt, shirt made in Egypt versus shirt made of Egyptian cotton, or he looked over my shoulder, inspected his shoulder versus looked in the direction over his shoulder. Different IC cuts can map these different meanings onto the sentence structure.
So IC analysis provides a way to visualize the hierarchical grouping of elements in a sentence and explain some cases of ambiguity. However, Palmer also points out several significant problems with IC analysis.
It wasn't perfect.
First, it doesn't inherently label the constituent types.
Right. The analysis gives you cuts, but it doesn't tell you that the young man is a noun phrase or that followed is a verb. It relies on prior assumptions about word classes, noun, verb, etc.
Which seems a bit circular.
Which Palmer notes creates a potential circularity of argument if you're trying to establish the fundamental units of syntax.
Second, it handles constituents smaller than words awkwardly until the very end, like the possessives in the King of England's hat.
Yes, the possessive ending belongs to the entire phrase, the King of England, not just England. An IC analysis would have to awkwardly cut the King of England and S, treating the latter as a constituent.
Which feels weird.
Which challenges the idea that words are the basic units you cut down to. Palmer notes this would require denying the fundamental place of the word in constituent analysis, which is controversial given how easily speakers recognize words.
But the most serious problem is discontinuity.
This is where elements that intuitively belong together are separated in the linear sequence of the sentence. Phrasal verbs are a classic example. She made the whole story up.
Made and up go together.
Made and up form a semantic unit. But the object, the whole story, comes between them. In a simple IC tree, you can't make a single cut that groups made and up together without also including the intervening object, because the cuts are meant to reflect linear segments.
You can't draw a nice clean box or tree branch around made and up while excluding the whole story.
Exactly. Palmer gives other examples. Such a lovely house.
Such
and lovely house feel connected but are separated by a.
Questions too.
Questions like, will John come? Also pose a discontinuity problem if you want to show will and come as parts of a single verb phrase constituent, because John is in between them. In a standard tree diagram, the branches representing will and come would have to cross, violating the non-crossing convention of IC analysis trees.
This problem of discontinuity, where elements appear to have moved from some more basic position, became a major driving force behind the development of the next big theoretical approach.
Before getting there, Palmer introduces phrase structure, PS rules, presented as a slightly different way of looking at sentence structure that leads to phrase structure grammar.
How is it different?
Instead of just analyzing existing sentences, this approach aims to generate or produce sentence structures using a set of rules.
This involves labeled bracketing or using labels in tree diagrams. Instead of just showing divisions, the analysis explicitly labels each constituent, like S for sentence, NP for noun phrase, VP for verb phrase.
DET for determiner, like the A, N for noun, V for verb. Yes. PS rules are formulas that describe how these constituents can be formed.
Give me a simple example.
A very simple set might look like SNP-VP. A sentence consists of a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase. NP-DETN. A noun phrase can consist of a determiner followed by a noun. VP-VNP. A verb phrase can consist of a verb followed by a noun phrase.
And these can generate sentences.
Applying these rules can generate simple sentence structures like the man followed a girl. The tree diagram visually represents this phrase marker.
These rules can be made more complex to reflect different sentence patterns, showing what kind of phrase structures can follow a verb.
Exactly. Some verbs take just an NP object, VP, VNP followed a girl. Others take a PP, VP, NP, PP set on the floor. Others take an adjective, VP, VA seems happy. And some take two NPs, VP, N, VNP, NP gave the man a book.
Can they show optional parts?
The rules can be written to show which elements are optional or required, capturing the patterns associated with different verbs, what traditional grammar called transitive, intransitive, detransitive, etc.
A really powerful feature of PS rules is recursion. How does that allow for potentially infinite sentences?
Recursion is the ability of a rule to call itself, either directly or indirectly. For instance, a rule for noun phrases might allow for optional adjectives, NP, DP, A, N. But to allow any number of adjectives,
like the big red fluffy...
the naughty little English boys, you need a rule that lets a noun phrase contain another noun phrase, or lets a noun contain modified nouns.
What about coordination, like and?
A common PS rule for coordination is X, and X is X, where X can be any constituent type. N, V, S, etc. A sequence of coordinated nouns like cats, dogs, and horses is itself a noun N, meaning you can add another noun, cats, dogs, and horses, and birds, is also an N. This recursive structure allows for theoretically infinite coordination.
It creates layers that can be repeated.
Yes. Embedding or subordination also uses recursion. A rule might say that a verb phrase can be followed by a sentence, VP by VS.
How does that work?
This allows generating structures like, he said S, he was coming, showing that the embedded clause is itself a sentence constituent within the larger VP. Since that embedded S can also contain a VP, which might allow another S, and so on, you can theoretically embed sentences within sentences indefinitely. John thinks that Mary believes that Bill said that.
So PS rules, with labeled bracketing and recursion, can generate many complex structures and show the structural relationships in a hierarchy. They can even handle some ambiguity, like the old men and women, by generating two different PS structures depending on how the rules apply.
But they still struggle with discontinuity, those elements that seem out of place compared to a simpler structure.
Exactly. And that struggle, along with the desire to capture the relationships between different sentence types like active and passive, was the main motivation for the next major development. Transformational generative, TG grammar.
Building on PS rules, TG adds transformations.
What's a transformation?
A transformation is a formal rule that takes one phrase structure, or tree diagram, as input and produces another phrase structure as output by moving, adding, deleting, or changing elements. It's not just changing words, but transforming the structure.
And the passive is a key example.
Palmer uses the passive transformation as a key example. It takes the structure for an active sentence, like the boy kicked the ball, and relates it to the structure for the passive sentence, the ball was kicked by the boy.
How does the transformation do that? What steps are involved?
It involves several steps. The object NP, the ball, moves to become the subject. The original subject NP, the boy, moves to a position after the verb, introduced by. The main verb kicked changes form to be plus past participle, becoming was kicked.
So it systematically relates active and passive.
Palmer notes that early TG theory even proposed some basic kernel sentences, simple, active, declarative, from which all other sentence types were derived by applying various transformations. This idea was later revised, but it shows the thinking some structures were seen as more fundamental.
TG also used PS rules to generate abstract structures for the complex English auxiliary verb system.
Yes. PS rules like O tense have plus N, be plus ing, could generate underlying sequences like John past have plus on C, or John present be plus ing read.
But the endings aren't attached yet.
The actual position of the suffixes like S for present tense, ed for past, N for past participle, and ing for present participle isn't generated directly attached to the main verb. Instead, a crucial and obligatory transformation called affix hopping was proposed.
Affix hopping.
This rule would hop the suffix over the next verb to attach to it. Tense plus a verb plus tense, past plus C plus past saw, present plus have plus present has. This transformation happened for all affixes.
So the process of generating a sentence involved creating an underlying structure and then applying rules that moved things around and attached endings.
Exactly. This led to the core idea in the standards theory of TG, associated with Chomsky's work in the 1960s, the distinction between deep structure, DS, and surface structure, SS.
Deep and surface. How did they relate?
PS rules generated the DS, which was seen as a more abstract representation capturing the fundamental grammatical relations. Transformations then applied to the DS to produce the SS, which is the final form of the sentence we actually speak or write. DS was the input, SS the output of the transformational component.
The deep structure was more abstract. Did it contain things we don't see on the surface?
Yes. The theory introduced abstract elements in the DS that weren't always realized as physical words in the SS. Examples include pass as a marker in the DS of a passive sentence,
like trigger,
Q in the DS of a question, or delta as a dummy subject in certain structures. The presence of these abstract elements triggered the application of specific obligatory transformations. So if pass was in the DS, the passive transformation had to apply. If Q was present, the question transformation, transposing subject and auxiliary, for instance, was obligatory.
And for agentless passives, like the man was killed, without a corresponding active killed the man, how was that handled?
Early TG initially struggled with this, but the idea of the dummy subject provided a solution. The DS could be something like, A passed, kill the man by pass.
So delta is the unknown agent.
The pass triggers the passive transformation, moving the man to subject position. Then, a separate rule deletes the by phrase, resulting in the man was killed.
But couldn't the PS rules also generate "oh, past kill the man" without the bypass? If so, wouldn't that structure still result in killed the man after the main NP moves, which is ungrammatical?
Yes, that's a potential issue. To block the generation of such ungrammatical surface structures, TG introduced mechanisms like filters.
Filters, like sieves.
Filters apply after all transformations have run, examining the resulting surface structure. A filter can be formulated to rule out any surface structure that still contains the dummy subject or certain arrangements involving it, unless it was specifically deleted in a valid transformation context, like the agentless passive deletion.
So deep structure doesn't need a subject, but surface structure does.
This implies that while deep structure might not need a specific subject NP for every sentence type, surface structure must have one.
Another key transformation was we movement, crucial for questions starting with who, what, which, etc. Which books has Jill bought?
The TG analysis proposed that the we phrase originates in the position where a regular noun phrase with that grammatical function would appear in the deep structure.
So where the answer would go.
So the DS for which books has Jill bought might be something like Jill has bought which books. A transformation then applies to move the which books phrase from its original position, object of bought, to the front of the sentence.
Can it move far?
Palmer shows this movement can happen even across multiple embedded clauses. Which books do you think Bill said that Mary hopes that Jill has bought?
This model, with DS generated by PS rules, transformations applying to get SS, and mechanisms like filters to ensure grammaticality, offered a powerful way to capture the underlying relationships between sentences and account for phenomena like discontinuity and shared structures despite surface differences.
It provided a much richer framework for syntactic analysis than previous models like IC analysis.
This leads us into some of the complexities and later developments within TG as linguists refined the theory and encountered new puzzles. Palmer discusses different types of movement and reasoning.
He uses the contrast between I wanted the doctor to examine John and I persuaded the doctor to examine John.
They look similar on the surface.
On the surface, they look very similar. Subject, verb, noun, phrase, infinitive clause. But intuitively, the relationship between the main verb and the noun phrase, the doctor, is different.
How so?
As Palmer notes, you wanted the situation or the fact represented by the doctor to examine John, while you persuaded the doctor to do something.
So the doctor is the object of persuaded in the second sentence, but seems to be the subject of the embedded clause in the first.
Precisely. This difference in underlying grammatical relation, despite surface similarity, is a key motivation for analyses involving raising.
Raising, like lifting something.
Raising is a transformation where a noun phrase is moved from its original position in an embedded clause up into a position in the main clause.
Palmer illustrates this with the classic pair, John is easy to please versus John is eager to please.
Superficially similar adjective plus infinitive constructions, but they behave differently. He notes the test. You can say it is easy to please John, but you can't say it is eager to please John.
Why does that work?
That test suggests a different underlying structure. For John is easy to please, the underlying thought is something like, it is easy to please John. Here, the subject of is easy is the entire embedded clause to please John. John is originally the object within that embedded clause.
And for eager,
for John is eager to please, the underlying structure is more like John is eager for John to please someone. Here, John is the subject of the main clause and the subject of the embedded clause.
And how does raising connect these? How does John get to the front in easy to please?
For John is easy to please, the analysis proposes that John is raised from its object position in the embedded clause to please John. To become the subject of the main clause is easy.
Subject to subject raising.
This is often called subject to subject raising because an element moves to subject position, although in this specific case, the element was originally an object in the embedded clause. This raising analysis also explains why the main verb agrees with the raised noun phrase, the boy is easy to please versus the boys are easy to please.
Palmer also discusses an earlier idea called subject-to-object raising, used for sentences like, Columbus is believed.
That analysis suggested Columbus was raised from the subject position of an embedded clause, that Columbus discovered America, to become the object of the main verb believe, resulting in an intermediate structure like, someone believes Columbus to have discovered America.
And then passive.
Then the passive transformation applied to the main clause, moving Columbus to the subject position. Columbus is believed. However, Palmer notes this analysis was criticized because it didn't seem to reflect the semantic relation. Well, the belief is about the proposition or fact that Columbus discovered America, not primarily about Columbus as an object of belief.
A later analysis, preferred by Palmer, handles this using subject-to-subject raising again, but treats the embedded clause as the original subject of the main clause.
Yes. The underlying structure could be that Columbus discovered America is believed by everyone. The embedded clause is the subject of the passive main clause.
And then Columbus moves.
Then Columbus is raised from the subject position within the embedded clause, that Columbus discovered America, to become the subject of the main clause. Columbus is believed by everyone to have discovered America. This analysis aligns the believe structure with the easy structure and also works for verbs like seen. Mary seems to have seen.
And this approach allows generating the passive version of the embedded clause too, like America is believed.
Yes. You could have a structure like that America was discovered by Columbus is believed by everyone, where the embedded clause is already passive. Then America is raised from the subject position within the embedded clause to become the subject of the main clause. America is believed by everyone to have been discovered by Columbus.
So transformations like raising helped account for these subtle structural differences and relationships.
However, as TG developed, Palmer notes that some of the early claims about its power were questioned. Its ability to fully explain all cases of ambiguity, like flying planes can be dangerous.
Right, we talked about that.
Or the complexities of coordination, joining structures with and or, proved more challenging than initially hoped.
We saw how IC analysis could show ambiguity with different cuts. Palmer notes PS structures and agreement tests, flying planes is dangerous versus flying planes are dangerous, can also share ambiguity without relying solely on transformations.
And handling coordination by simply joining sentences and deleting repeated parts turned out to be incredibly complicated.
This led to a more detailed focus on precisely how to restrict the power of transformations and prevent the system from generating ungrammatical sentences. This involved refining the concepts of constraints and filters.
Since movement rules, like the what movement we saw, could potentially move elements from anywhere to anywhere, leading to ungrammatical results, constraints were proposed to block these movements in specific structural contexts.
These are rules that say, essentially, this transformation cannot apply here. A prominent type were the island constraints.
Islands, like parts of the sentence that are isolated from movement?
Exactly. Certain types of clauses or phrases were found to be islands from which elements couldn't be extracted by movement transformations like wife renting.
Give me an example.
Palmer gives examples. You can't move which books out of a relative clause. Which books does he know the man who bought which books? Becomes the ungrammatical. Which books does he know the man who bought?
Okay, you can't reach into the relative clause.
You can't move it out of certain we clauses. What did he ask whether you bought? And you often can't move out of subject clauses. What that he reads is obvious.
These seem like intuitive boundaries. They do. A more general principle, the subjacency condition, was proposed to unify many of these. It states that movement cannot cross more than one boundary or node, like a clause boundary or sometimes an NP boundary, at a time. This condition helps explain why moving elements out of islands is often blocked.
But that seems problematic for sentences where a why phrase moves across many clauses, like, which books do you think Bill said that Mary hopes that Jill has bought? That crosses multiple clause boundaries.
Palmer notes this as a significant challenge to simple subjacency. Complex arguments, often involving the why phrase moving step by step through intermediate positions, one boundary at a time, were proposed to handle this.
But Palmer was skeptical.
But Palmer characterizes these arguments as highly technical and complex, if not somewhat artificial and possibly circular.
Another constraint is the coordinated structure constraint.
This constraint says you generally cannot move an element out of just one part of a coordinate structure, joined by and, or, while leaving the other part intact. So, what did John buy and sell a car is ungrammatical because what is moved out of the by what part of the coordinated phrase buy what and sell a car, leaving sell a car stranded without a parallel moved element.
So constraints block the transformations from happening in the first place. What about filters again? How are they different?
Filters are another way to block ungrammatical sentences, but they apply after the transformations have run to the resulting surface structure. They function by marking certain outputs as ill-formed.
Like the dummy delta filter.
We saw the example of filtering out surface structures containing the dummy element if it hadn't been properly deleted. Filters are more tied to specific outcomes, whereas constraints are tied to the process of movement itself.
Do you need both?
Palmer ends this discussion by leaving open the question of whether a linguistic theory needs both mechanisms or if one should be sufficient, depending on how the rules are formulated.
So, these complex mechanisms are necessary to ensure the theoretical system generates only the grammatical sentences that speakers actually use. This intense focus on structure and rules led to another major question. Does deep structure really capture the full meaning of a sentence?
The standard theory claimed that DS was the sole basis for semantic interpretation. But arguments arose suggesting DS, as defined by its role as the input to transformations, wasn't sufficient to capture all aspects of meaning.
Like the ideas from case theory by linguists like Charles Fillmore.
Yes. Fillmore argued for a deeper level of structure than DS, one that represented the underlying semantic roles or cases, more directly roles like agent, the one doing the action, object, the one the action is done to, dative, the one receiving, etc.
He looked at verb meanings.
He showed how verbs assign different roles to their arguments. Palmer uses the contrast between see and look at. While both relate to vision, see involves an experiencer, dative subject, and something perceived, objective object, while look at involves an agent, agentive subject, and something being looked at, objective object.
And DS didn't always show that difference.
This semantic difference in roles wasn't always clearly reflected in the syntactic DS of the standard theory and challenged its claim to be the sole semantic base. Although Palmer notes that one could argue this semantic role information is simply part of the meaning listed in the lexicon dictionary for each verb, rather than needing a separate level of structure.
Another challenge came from sentence trios, like those involving verbs such as open or break.
Ah, yes. John opened the door. The door opened. The door was opened by John.
You have the active transitive, the intransitive, and the passive. These seem intuitively related, and you'd hope TG could generate them from a common source.
But the pattern doesn't always work.
But this pattern of active, intransitive, passive doesn't apply to many other transitive verbs. You can't say the wall hit corresponding to John hit the wall. This posed a problem for a theory trying to capture systematic relationships.
And the meaning of logical words like quantifiers, many, few, all, or negatives, could be tricky.
The classic example, many arrows did not hit the target. This sentence has two possible interpretations based on the scope of the negative.
Meaning one,
It could mean many arrows did not hit the target, focusing on the arrows, many of them missed.
meaning two.
Or it could mean not many arrows hit the target. It's not the case that many arrows hit it. Maybe only a few hit, or none at all.
And DS struggled with this ambiguity.
This difference in meaning based on the scope of the negative wasn't always clear how DS would represent. All these issues led Chomsky, as Palmer recounts, to conclude that the two major properties attributed to deep structure, being the input to transformations and being the sole basis for semantic interpretation, might be independent.
Which was a big shift.
This prompted a significant shift. Initially, it was proposed that some semantic interpretation, like that related to logical words or even intonation and stress in spoken language, might come from surface structure, while other meaning aspects still came from DS.
But later,
But more recently, Palmer mentions, the argument has shifted towards the idea that all semantic interpretation might be derived from the surface structure, but only after the SS has been modified or enriched in specific ways.
and this is where concepts like traces and binding come in, using a modified SS for semantics.
Exactly. If semantics comes from SS, how do you explain the meaning difference in easy, eager sentences? Or how do you know where a moved element, like a we phrase, originally came from?
How do we know that in which books did you buy? Which books is the object of buy?
The solution proposed in later TG models is the concept of traces. These are empty, unpronounced categories left behind in the surface structure at the position from which a noun phrase or other constituent has been moved.
So the SS actually includes the empty slot.
So the surface structure of which books did you buy would be represented with a trace like which books did you buy T. The trace T marks the original object position and shows that which books is linked to that position for semantic interpretation.
And this explains.
This also helps explain why sentences like what did you buy the book are ungrammatical. If what is moved from the object position, its trace occupies that spot, leaving the book without a grammatical function.
So the trace is like a footprint left by the movement. That's a good analogy. For passive sentences like dams are built by beavers, the SS with a trace might be dams are built by beavers.
What does the trace show there?
The trace T indicates that dams originated in the object position of built in the initial structure. often called D structure in these later models. However, Palmer notes that this doesn't necessarily mean beavers was the subject in that initial structure. The subject position in the trace theory analysis is typically assumed to be occupied by the element that ends up as the surface subject, BAMS in this case, before the trace is left behind in the object position.
What about those unpronounced subjects of infinitive clauses we saw with want versus persuade, like Bill wants to meet Mary?
These are handled with PRO. PRO stands for an abstract, unpronounced pronoun. It's proposed as the subject of certain types of infinitive clauses, like in Bill wants PRO to meet Mary.
And PRO refers back to Bill.
PRO is understood to refer to the same person as Bill. This coreference is indicated by co-indexing. Bill wants PRO to meet Mary. This mechanism helps explain why reflexive pronouns, himself, and ordinary pronouns him, behave differently in these clauses, based on whether they refer to the same person within a specific structural domain.
Give an example.
Bill wants PRO to help himself is grammatical because PRO and himself are co-indexed and in the same clause, the infinitive clause. Bill wants PRO to help him is grammatical because PRO and him are not co-indexed, referring to different people.
And binding is the theory that formalizes these relationships.
Yes, binding theory is a formal set of principles or conditions governing when pronouns, reflexives, and other noun phrases can or must refer to the same entities, be co-indexed, based on their structural position within a sentence, particularly within clauses.
So it explains pronoun reference.
An element is bound if it's co-indexed with an antecedent that's in a specific structural position relative to it. These principles aim to capture speakers' intuitive judgments about when pronouns can refer to a preceding noun phrase.
It sounds like the theoretical models, while complex, are trying to account for finer and finer points of structural relationship and interpretation that we as speakers handle effortlessly.
That's exactly the goal. The focus shifts from simply describing surface forms to positing abstract structures and principles that explain the intricate system underlying our linguistic abilities.
So, given all these different models, IC analysis, PS rules, TG with DSS, transformations, constraints, filters, traces, PRO, binding, what does this theoretical work tell us about the nature of our own knowledge of language and how linguists actually do their research? Palmer touches on this towards the end.
He discusses Chomsky's proposal that a speaker's knowledge of their language is a kind of unconscious intuition. It's not like knowing how to swim, which is purely knowing how.
What did Chomsky think it was?
Chomsky suggested it might be more akin to knowing that, but at an unconscious level.
But Palmer expresses skepticism about the concept of unconscious knowledge if it's meant to be more than just knowing how.
Right. What exactly is it, and how can we describe it meaningfully outside of potentially looking at brain structure or function, which is neurology, not linguistics?
If it's just knowing how.
If it's just knowing how, then yes, linguists agree speakers know how to use their language. But if it's more, it becomes philosophically and empirically tricky.
A key positive insight that emerged from the generative approach, Palmer notes, is a greater appreciation for the creativity of speakers.
That's crucial.
We don't just repeat sentences we've heard. We constantly produce and understand entirely new sentences. Early structuralism focused mainly on analyzing existing texts, recorded speech or writing. Generative linguistics, by aiming to generate all the possible grammatical sentences of a language, shifted the focus to defining what is possible in language.
Which is a very powerful perspective.
That's a really valuable shift, focusing on the capacity for language, not just the recorded instances.
However, Palmer adds a word of caution about the data used in this kind of theoretical research. Even generative linguists rely on data, either existing language, texts, or their own intuition as native speakers, their judgments about whether a sentence is grammatical or not.
And the danger?
The danger here, Palmer points out, is the potential for researcher bias. It can be tempting to invent examples or make judgments about grammaticality that conveniently support the theory you are trying to prove.
It's a potential pitfall in any scientific endeavor, confirmation bias.
Indeed. As Palmer Riley notes, those asterisked sentences, meaning ungrammatical, in theoretical works, are sometimes said to be simply those English sentences that would contradict the proposals being made.
That's cynical, but maybe fair.
It highlights the delicate balance linguists must strike between building elegant theories and ensuring they are rigorously supported by objective evidence, whether from large corpora of real language or carefully validated judgments from multiple speakers.
Describing the incredibly complex, mostly unconscious system that allows us to communicate is clearly a challenging task, requiring sophisticated tools and a constant questioning of assumptions.
It certainly is.
Before we wrap up this deep dive into linguistic grammar, Palmer sprinkles in a few delightful and surprising quirks of English specifically, things that make you pause and think about how odd our everyday language can be when you look closely.
Oh, the little oddities.
One he mentions is the pronunciation of the verb says. In standard English, it's pronounced says, rhyming with fez.
Right.
But Palmer notes that comic writers, or those wanting to indicate a character speaks in a substandard way, will often spell it says.
Ironically, using a spelling that actually represents the standard pronunciation.
That's completely counterintuitive. We see says and think non-standard, but that's actually how most people say the standard form.
Exactly. Another quirk involves the word postman, and it's plural postmen. In written English, the plural involves a vowel change, making it look like mouse mice.
Written, yes, but spoken.
But in spoken English, the plural is often pronounced the same as the singular, like sheep, sheep. Palmer gives the example. The postman came up the street versus the postman came up the street. In rapid spoken English, those might sound identical.
You wouldn't hear the difference.
And you'd only know the number from context or other words like they or all.
So the spoken plural of postman can actually behave more like sheep than mouse in terms of sound.
Yes. And speaking of irregularities, Palmer highlights the auxiliary verbs. Does is irregular in pronunciation in standard speech, D-A-E-S, even though its spelling, do plus E-E-S, looks regular like go-go's.
Won't and shan't, too.
Won't and shan't are irregularly formed contractions for will not and shall not. Can't is irregular in both writing and common speech pronunciation. Mustn't is irregular in common speech pronunciation. Mustn't, dropping the T sound before the N, though the T is written.
The auxiliaries are a minefield.
Palmer notes most auxiliaries have irregular third-person singular S forms. Is, has, does, can, doesn't even have an SF form like cans, while says is the only main verb with such an irregular S form.
Speaking of plurals again, Palmer touches on collective nouns like committee or country names used for sports teams like England.
Yes. They commonly take plural verbs in British English. The committee have decided England have won the World Cup.
But they're not quite plural.
But they don't behave like true plurals everywhere. You can't say, these committee have decided. They have this dual nature, singular in form, but often treated as plural for verb agreement.
And those nouns that are only ever plural, like scissors, trousers?
Grammatically plural, even if semantically referring to a single item made of two parts. You can't use singular articles, or scissors, or numerals without pair of 10 scissors, but you use plural demonstratives, these scissors. It's a grammatical classification independent of simple countability.
Finally, intonation.
Palmer notes how intonation in spoken English resolves ambiguities that written English sometimes struggles with. For instance, I only saw John can be ambiguous in writing.
Did I just see him or see only him?
Did I just see John and do nothing else? Or was John the only person I saw? Traditionally, advice is given to rewrite to clarify. I saw John only. But in speech, intonation makes it clear instantly. I only saw John. Stress on only means all I did was see him. I only saw John. Stress on John means he was the sole person I saw. The invisible stress pattern is a crucial part of the grammar of spoken English.
These little examples are great because they show that even in our familiar language, there are these subtle, sometimes strange structures and behaviors that we navigate constantly without thinking, but which reveal the underlying complexity linguists study.
They certainly make you appreciate the intricate system you're using every moment you're communicating.
So we began this deep dive with the common experience of grammar as a dry, rule-bound subject from school, something maybe best forgotten. But our journey through F.R. Palmer's book has painted a very different picture.
We've seen that grammar for a linguist is a deep scientific exploration of the intricate, often invisible system that makes language work. It's not about prescribing rules to follow.
Not about being correct,
but about describing the structure you already possess and use effortlessly.
We've challenged the easy misconceptions, uncovered the often arbitrary origins of prescriptive rules in history and social judgment, and explored the sophisticated, sometimes abstract ways linguists have attempted to map the structure of language.
From words to sentences.
From the elusive nature of the word and the complexities of morphology to the powerful but ever-evolving theories of sentence structure involving Deep structure, transformations, constraints, traces, and binding.
It's a system layered with history, shaped by social factors, and viewed through the lens of competing theoretical frameworks, each trying to better understand its hidden architecture.
The next time you hear someone speak or read a sentence, maybe pause for a moment and consider the invisible structure holding it all together.
What's right underneath?
The units that might not have spaces in speech, the grammatical categories that don't always map neatly onto meaning, the rules that might be arbitrary historical accidents or social markers, the subtle sound changes in words, the ways sentences are put together and subtly relate to each other, perhaps even the traces left behind by elements that seem to have moved. Is grammar ultimately about being master of language and Humpty Dumpty's sense of dictating meaning?